Alpine F1 are screwed. And I don't take pleasure in saying that. When you consider their current car, the A524, the amount of key staff leaving, interference from the top, and how divided the team reportedly are, the signs are not looking good. And none of this is helped further by mismanagement and a sense that Renault are not willing to invest further to push the team up the grid. And remember, Alpine is a works team, the face of Renault in Formula One, and also, if you believe their marketing and PR, a representation of France at the highest level of motorsports. But unlike when McLaren or Williams were at their lowest and began a fight back, it seems that Renault don't have the stomach for that sort of fight. At least right now they don't. And that is a shame, because it looks like Renault, or more accurately their board of directors, have forgotten who they are, what they once were, and what they could be again if led properly. So first things first, let's judge a book by its cover, and by that I mean the Alpine A524, their car for the 2024 season, which was once described as aggressive at the time of its launch. And once pre-season testing began, the world learned that it was quite the opposite, and by the time the season opener in Bahrain came along, both cars qualified back of the grid. And this wasn't starting at the back of the grid due to penalties or accidents. No, Alpine were at the back of the grid on merit. They were genuinely the slowest. And when you consider that Haas were favourites to have the tractor of the year this season, that is a serious downfall for the team. And even back in February, there were signs that Alpine were struggling with the birth of their new car. The A524 had failed a couple of crash tests, and in order to meet these new regulations, the chassis needs to be beefed up. But when you beef things up, this comes with extra weight. And the apparent weight problem was unveiled to the world in the form of an exposed carbon fiber car with a few pink and blue stickers on it. And so not only was the car heavy, it was also unstable aerodynamically, which meant for Ocon and Gasly it would be very difficult to drive competitively. And with Alpine still on 0 points after 2 races, heads had to roll, changes need to be made. And with that, Renault took action, and the top exec, Luca De Meo, we'll come back to him later, announced the resignations of technical director Matt Harmon and the head of aerodynamics, Dirk De Beer. And Alpine even saw long-time Benetton old boy, Bob Bell, join Aston Martin as an executive director. It is amazing when you consider some of the big names that Alpine have gone through over the years, whether that's Otmar Safnauer, Fernando Alonso, Oscar Piastri, even Alain Prost was there for a short while. And the Alpine team principal, Bruno Famin, who was only recently confirmed in this role not too long ago, has insisted that there has to be a shake-up and organisational changes have to be made. Even Famin himself has prioritised the need for closer collaboration and better relationships between the engine builders at Enstone in the UK and the power unit division based in Viry-Châtillon in France. And that's all good and well, and it sounds nice and fluffy in the media, but in order to do this, it requires investment and Renault to spend more money, and ultimately this is something that Renault are quite hesitant to do. Now, with everything so far, the problems with the car, personnel changes, undelivered promises and plans, whether that's a 100-race plan or a 5-year plan, from a fan's perspective, Alpine just seem lost. There's no direction. They are quite literally a zombie team right now, a pale comparison of what they once were. And another thing that's massive is that Renault haven't had a customer for their F1 engines since 2020. Now, I know Renault don't have the best reputation for their engines, but that's a sizable amount of money being lost every year by not having a customer for these things. And it's also another reason for Renault to be reluctant to put even more money into the F1 project. Recently on Alpine's Instagram page, they showed Pierre Gasly giving a motivational speech at one of the factories. Doesn't say which one, but judging by the body language of the guy sitting in the front row, they're not exactly there with open arms. Even Luca De Meo, the Renault CEO, visited Enstone to reaffirm Renault's commitments to the F1 team. Exactly how much reaffirming was done, I'm not sure, but given Renault's recent style, shall we say, of management, I'd say very little. De Meo must have been thinking, right, box ticked, Enstone reaffirmed, now get me on the first plane back to Paris. Even Pierre Gasly, who gave that motivational speech at the factory, he has less than 1 year left on his contract, and I guarantee he is probably on the phone to his agent saying, get me out of here. In fact, let's scratch that. Let's call it a contractually obliged motivational speech. Now, whilst Alpine are having to deal with apparently poor relationships between the two factories, which was brought to our attention last year, they are simultaneously having to deal with poor relationships between their two drivers, who unashamedly dislike each other and make no bones about it. Now, the tension between Ocon and Gasly has got to trickle down and affect the rest of the team. Even for you watching this now, if you work at an office or somewhere like that and two people publicly dislike each other, it does have an effect, even on that much smaller level. Now, if Alpine were dominating Red Bull style wins, championships and all that sort of stuff, let them argue, because the benefits massively outweigh the costs. But right now, they've got to get their act together, or else famine has got to bash their heads together. There's no room for this now at Alpine's level, and how Ocon and Gasly showcased themselves on Drive to Survive was just embarrassing. And with points maybe few and far between the season, I can't see Ocon and Gasly working together like Hülkenberg and Magnussen did at Haas at Saudi Arabia to get that one single point. Now, if they do actually work together, fair play, that's fine. But I'm fully expecting more of a every man for themselves attitude. And that could cost them dearly, not just to their team, but also their status as Formula One drivers when you consider how the market is looking for 2025. No team wants to hire a troublemaker, and they've got to clean up their act. Now, another indication that the team is in serious trouble is how Renault have envisioned it, and ultimately what purpose the team serves for the parent company. Is it a Formula One team, or is it a billboard to sell Alpine sports cars? Or is it a bit of both? And that's partly the trouble. At least when the team was Renault, you knew what it was about, and you knew what they're currently doing was a priority. But renamed as Alpine, it just seems like it's lower down the priority ladder. It seems, in fact, like it's just a side hustle for Renault right now. And I think that's what puts a lot of people off Alpine, because they're not what they say they are. Of all the teams currently on the Formula One grid, I think most fans would probably agree in saying that Alpine is probably the least charming or attractive to support and kind of get behind right now, and have actually been for some time. Alpine is in fact a very niche sports car brand. They make a very good car and do have a cult following. But to the everyday person on the street, Alpine isn't very well known, or Alpine as some people used to say. And I think Renault Group have to be careful that Alpine cars don't become associated with a failing Formula One team rather than a fairly decent sports car mark. And this is the problem. This is exactly why rallying and touring cars were so popular, because you could see a car win on Sunday and then go buy it on a Monday. And marrying together both your road car and your motorsport operations was perfect. And Renault was so good at this for decades. But now rallying and touring cars have sadly fallen by the wayside, and makes like Renault are trying to use the same strategy in F1. But fans see this, and I don't think they like it. And by that, I mean F1 being brought down to a level that suits car manufacturers, rather than having them having to step up to the level of Formula One. Yes, it's the V6 engines. Yes, it's the rubbish tyres. I know it's 2024 and everything, but it's not breathtaking anymore.
Runs yesterday. Oh, that sound is just so good, man. I mean...
Now, this next point, I've really been trying to come up with a good way of saying this, but it is that Alpine, and also Renault just before it became Alpine, really kind of overcooked the Frenchness of the team, or rather its claimed Frenchness and how it ties in with their identity and branding. And with that, they also stated that their ambition is to become the French Ferrari, which is absolute nonsense. You know, just be the French Alpine. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And in fact, people would probably respect your honesty on it as well. But it's just how the team have gone, look, we're a French team. We've got 2 French drivers. Look, we've got French flags on our overalls and our merchandise and everything. There's a French flag on the car. Look, we're French. Everything's French. Look, French cap, everything. We're French. But the thing is, the fans aren't stupid. They're not buying it. They know that although the engine is made in France, fair enough, the rest of it, everything else, is made in Enstone in the UK. And if you're working at Enstone, there must be a sense of not feeling represented, and that creates a tension, and then you get the friction between the 2 factories that we saw last year. And speaking of Ferrari, their Formula One cars for a period in the 80s and 90s used to be designed in Guildford in the UK, and this was before everything was brought back to Italy when Jean Todt, Michael Schumacher and Ross Brawn came along. And I think this season Alpine have toned down the whole French thing of the team somewhat, and I think that's probably the right thing to do. There's less flags on the car and less flags on the merchandise, and I think thanks to Bruno Famin, I think maybe he's trying to steer the team in more of a international effort. Now, with the season ahead, I'm sure Alpine can improve things and develop their car a little bit more, and hopefully end the season in a much better position than when it started. But if this decline continues and the rot is not stopped, I'm a little bit concerned as what could be the fate of the factory and team at Enstone. So just forget for a second how we see Alpine right now. Everything that happened before, the success, the championships wins, all came from the factory at Enstone. And with that, Renault supplied some excellent engines from their factory in France. So they're not tied together at the hip. But it's also important to remember that they don't have to be tied together for the future as well, which I'll get into in a second. And this is why it's a shame to see Alpine, or more importantly, Team Enstone, in its current state. It's not an open and closed case team like we saw with HRT, Caterham or Marussia. This is a team with legacy, with history and success, and we have to hang on to these as much as possible. Team Enstone has taken various forms over the years, but as Toleman, they gave Ayrton Senna his debut. As Benetton, they turned Michael Schumacher into a double world champion. And then later as Renault, they also turned Alonso into a double world champion. And yes, it did see wins from Kimi Raikkonen in its guise as Lotus, but since Renault returned and then it's morphed into Alpine, it's just been a downhill slide ever since. And a fairly disappointing journey, considering it's a works team. Now, there have been regular rumours of Renault being interested in selling the team, and Eddie Jordan recently on his podcast with David Coulthard mentioned this as well, saying that now is the time for Renault to sell up and get out. And with that, Andretti have also been touted as potential prospects. I'm not really sure. But unfortunately, bringing in a Zach Brown or a James Vowles type character to turn things around isn't going to work by now. There's too much interference from the top, and Alpine is just too messy and too complicated for one person to solve. It could even be just too far gone by this stage. Now, McLaren and Williams were able to recover because they started fresh with new owners and a pretty brutal self-assessment on their current situation. And this in turn gave them something to build on, and it looks like Renault are just not looking to look at the problem in the face. So whilst I admit, yes, Alpine is somewhat doomed in its current setup, and yes, it is sad that it has actually gone this way, but there are solutions available, and more importantly, Renault need to decide if they still have the stomach for Formula One. And so there you have it. Let me know in the comments. Please give the video a like if you enjoyed. I'm Paul, and I'll see you later. Cheers.